this is a unique moment and a unique historical opportunity to change really the trajectory of our country, but of the entire Middle East for generations.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Yaakov Katz, former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He previously served as the paper's military reporter and defense analyst. He's also the author of While Israel Slept: How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East. Mr. Katz joins us today to discuss the Israeli perspective on the situation in Iran and the outlook for the region going forward. Stay with us as we speak with Yaakov Katz. Yaakov Katz, welcome back to NatSec Matters.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Yaakov, let's just start with the simple question. What is the view of the Iran war from Israel?
For the most part, I mean, if we look at the numbers, right, just simple polling here, Israelis are overwhelmingly supportive of the war. You have different polls, but the numbers are over 80% of Israelis who support this war. And I think it stems from a very simple reason, is the fact that Iran, and Israelis recognize this to some extent, that until now, we've been fighting a battle against the proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and others. But Iran is the source of everything. And if this war can really change that reality, then Israelis are willing to, I guess, for lack of a better term, suffer a bit of time, right? Bomb shelters, sirens, disruption to life, kids being out of school, workplaces being closed for several weeks now already, because they understand that this is a unique moment and a unique historical opportunity to change really the trajectory of our country, but of the entire Middle East for generations.
Yeah. How are the prospects of regime change seen in Israel? Here, people are skeptical. We can't see any signs of unrest. Where is Israel on this? And or is the intelligence community, for example, your intelligence community, do they have insights that we don't?
Well, I mean, I'll split it into two levels. On the one hand, Israelis as a people don't have the same, I say, baggage that the American people carry with them from the two wars of Iraq and Afghanistan and prior or previous regime change, if you could call it that, attempts. And therefore, from a foreign policy perspective, from a security perspective, Israelis as a people are just less hesitant or cautious about those types of objectives, because for us, it's not something that we are traumatized or scarred from, like, let's say, the general American public. Internally, I think the war began with a belief, and I've heard this from people in government, that even like the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, on the first day of the war, that Saturday, almost now just 3 weeks ago, when the decapitation mission was launched and Khamenei was taken out, a bunch of his lieutenants were taken out, there was a belief that this could lead to a toppling of the regime. We've seen that the decapitation efforts have continued by Israel. It's actually interesting to look at, Michael, is, you probably have insight into why this is, but America is not killing people, right? In other words, is not targeting and assassinating the top officials. In the division of labor between the two militaries, it is Israel each time that is the one that is killing Ali Larijani, or killing the commander of the Basij, or killing, as it was just a couple days ago, the intelligence minister. It's not the United States. They're focused on other targets, and that probably has a lot to do with just legal issues in America and what it means to have to go out and assassinate someone. But for Israel, it's a long-standing doctrine and policy, whether it's against terrorist leaders. We saw it definitely over the last 2.5 years during the war that broke out and erupted after October 7th, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah and other Hamas leaders. That's a well-known Israeli tactic. I think that now, though, we're seeing a changing in the messaging that's coming out from the political echelon. If in the beginning of the war, Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke openly about the prospect for regime change, he's now being much more cautious. There's a recognition that it's not going to fall that quickly. It's not going to fall that simply. That even for all these people who are taken out, they still are retaining the Iranians for that are still retaining command and control, still have the ability to launch rockets, still have some control over the military and their ballistic missile arsenal. So it's not that simple. It's not as if you kill a couple people, although it has to be said, and I've heard this from people within military intelligence, is that some of these people who were killed, like if you look at the chief of staff of the Iranian military who was killed in that opening operation, he had been in his job, I think, for about 15 years, right? If you look at some of these, Khamenei, of course, had been in his role for, the last, 37 years, right? But they're institutions. So it's not like, I think the American armed forces and the Israeli military are similar in that sense that there's a constant change of command every few years in position. So God forbid this should never happen. But if in Israel or in America, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the chief of staff, the commander of the Air Force, et cetera, were somehow taken out, there would be people who could quickly fill those roles. I think there it's a little more difficult. But with that said, I wouldn't underestimate their ability to keep fighting.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Israeli targeting. The courts, we just discussed the decapitation strikes, and we expect those to continue. In the category of regime change, maybe you can confirm this, I've read as of last week, in addition to just hitting the Basij and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, Israel has been hitting local police stations, and this week I've read they're actually hitting checkpoints around at least Tehran, probably other places too. Do I have that right?
This is true. There have been a number of strikes that Israel has even made public that you have aircraft, whether it's drones or manned aircraft, we don't always know, but aircraft that have been bombing Basij checkpoints in major cities, particularly Tehran itself. Look, there's a question that we could ask. Does it make sense for an aircraft to be used to take out 3 Basij guys standing at a checkpoint on a street in the middle at some intersection in downtown Tehran? Those attacks, as I understand them, are much more symbolic. There's been a recognition, I think, since the beginning of this war, Operation Epic Fury and Roaring Lion, as it's called in Israel, that there aren't going to be boots on the ground. This isn't another Iraq or another Afghanistan. And therefore, as President Trump himself said in the beginning of all of this, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has repeated a number of times, it'll be up to the Iranian people to take advantage of this moment and seize this opportunity. So these strikes against, 3-4 Basij guys standing at an intersection, Michael, this, like I heard an Israeli commander to talk to journalists, and he was saying how we've killed, 4,000 people, right? Security personnel. So I just went into Google and looked up, how big is the Iranian military? How big is the IRGC? How big is the Basij? We're talking about north of 600,000. So, right. 3,000 is not going to make a dent in that. But symbolically to the people of Iran, when they see that they have people who are covering them from the air, are taking out 3-4 guys at a checkpoint, maybe that will give them the motivation to go out to the streets and to try to really move something. No guarantee, but that is the thinking behind those types of operations.
And it seems Israel, maybe unlike the United States, which has a different target set, that you're going to run all the plays that you can and hope to create the conditions where they can come back out.
Yeah, look, Israel's focus in, I would say, phase 1 of the war was the ballistic missiles, was the ability of Iran to attack us, right? That had very much was the focus in the phase 1. The nuclear installations as well. We hear a little less about that because I think to some extent, while June, the 12-day war was not the success that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump had made it out to be, but the nuclear sites had been significantly damaged then. There were still some follow-up attacks, what we've seen over the last weeks. The second stage of the operation from the Israeli perspective has been to start to go after the facilities themselves, then the targets that you can say are part of the repressive apparatus of the regime. So IRGC headquarters, Basij headquarters, commander of the Basij, these checkpoints, etc. And this is really to give the Iranian people that opportunity. If we make it to stage 3 of the war, I think stage 3 will look something along the lines of the Iranian people are on the streets and they have air cover. They have the defense, and they have Israeli planes and maybe American planes that are providing them with air cover and air support to be able to fight to take down the regime. It sounds good, but you know, Michael, this isn't anything but easy or simple.
Well, that's fascinating. I've not quite heard it put that way. I've heard people describe the Iranian people could possibly be our ground force, but I like the idea that we're their air force as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the recent targeting by Israel and this controversy of hitting Iran's South Pars gas field. There's seemingly at least a spat in the public about whether the White House knew about this, whether they signed off, and the circumstances in which Israel decided to hit it. And that's of course all the more important because the retaliation, apparently, if you believe this, 17% of Qatar's gas will now be off the market for 2 to 3 years while they rebuild. Can you shed any light on this?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's something that we need to remember, and this is important because before, and I emphasize again, before the Israeli strike on South Pars, on that gas area or refinery or whatever it was, Iran had already attacked the Ras Laffan LNG complex in Qatar. It had already attacked the Ras Tanura oil refinery in Saudi. There had been hundreds of drone attacks against a variety of Saudi oil fields. There were attacks against the Ruwais refinery in Abu Dhabi, the Shah gas field in Abu Dhabi, the port of Fujairah in the UAE, and others. So this was all before. Now, South Pars is being seen as an escalation in the Israeli targeting, but it is important to point out that it comes after weeks of Iranian attacks against Gulf energy infrastructure. So that's just one thing, just to give it context. The second thing to keep in mind here, and I don't know for certain, but what I do know is that after it was attacked, Israel was very quick to clarify that it was done in complete coordination with the United States. And what leads me to believe that that is true are two things. Number one, this operation or this war is really being fought in the most intimate way possible, imaginable, between the Israeli military and the U.S. and CENTCOM. You have, for example, in the United States, in Air Force bases there, you have Israeli Air Force officers who are sitting together going over targets. You have that going on here in Israel, in the underground command centers in Tel Aviv and at Air Force bases. It's very hard to imagine how Israel could just decide to do something without that being first coordinated, number one. Number two, Prime Minister Netanyahu, from a communications policy and strategy for this war, has been very, very quiet. He occasionally speaks, mostly recorded videos, barely has held press conferences, nothing at the scale of what you're seeing every day in the United States, whether it's Secretary of War Hegseth or the president himself who's taking questions and talking to the public. It's being very careful, and Netanyahu's being very careful, and his ministers don't talk a lot also, to not do anything that would be out of line and would upset the president and would get him to change his policy. So therefore, I don't see why Israel would want to do and would escalate this in that way. Now, I know there are people who are going to say, well, Israel wanted to escalate, so the Iranians would escalate and the war would potentially continue, because that fits the narrative definitely of those, especially whether it's on the left or on the far right, who want to push this narrative that it's Israel that dragged the United States into this war, and this further feeds that idea. But it just doesn't, it goes up against the hard evidence. Israel would not have said this was coordinated if it wasn't coordinated. Now, of course, the president has said, I've asked Israel not to do it.
Right.
But that could all be part of this game that they are playing, that Israel is kind of the mad dog or the Rottweiler, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. And the president reins Israel in when needed. And that might help push the Iranians into a corner that they would either agree to some sort of ceasefire conditions or to what seems to be the focus right now, which is getting the Strait of Hormuz open and getting it out of Iranian control.
Yeah. General Tamir Heyman said at a Washington think tank event recently that Israel isn't worried a bit about the price of oil or gas. You're in it to win it. And I wonder if you agree with that, and if you can, because that sort of speaks to you all are ready to hit economic targets, whereas we're at least ambivalent about it.
Look, Israelis, no one here talks about the price of gas, right? It's not an issue. We're anyhow paying a lot of money to begin with. Yeah. And if we got to pay a little more, that's not what people are going to be upset about. I know that in the US and in Europe, gas prices are up 20, 30% in certain places, and that's hurting people in their pocket. And that definitely impacts the popularity of this war and whether politicians will want to continue it. But that's not a concern for Israel. In the same vein, Michael, you see that the U.S. in the divvying up of the targets, what was one of America's first targets was the Iranian Navy, right? They took the southwest of Iran because they're focused on the Strait. It doesn't interest Israel, right? Israel doesn't really care too much. I mean, it's an important issue. It's a global issue. But what we're fighting for here is something that's a little different, right? Israel, from its perspective, is fighting to really take out the regime, ideally, but at the very least, its capabilities to develop a nuclear weapon and to provide its proxies, primarily Hezbollah, with weapons that could also threaten us. So degrade their nuclear and ballistic missile and stop their supply and support of proxies. Strait of Hormuz is maybe for Israel number 4 on the priorities of targets here.
I see. Let's talk a little bit now about one of the other ostensible objectives of this campaign, and that's to finish off the residual parts of Iran's nuclear program. I think, I'm just assessing here, that when President Trump made Israel stop after 12 days in June, Israel still had other targets to prosecute. And since then, and I'm wondering if you can confirm this, it feels like the missing highly enriched uranium at 60%, that if upblended to 90% would yield to, I think I heard 11 nuclear bombs,
right,
is now, instead of being hopelessly buried in rubble, the New York Times has reported there might be a narrow corridor for a way to get it. So it sounds like we're really worried about that. And that's led to a discussion here in the United States of, would we, with you or us by ourselves, mount some sort of daring, it's more than a raid, it sounds like a 48-hour deployment to dig it out and fly it out. Do I have that right? And what's your assessment?
Well, I mean, when the war ended in June, there was the what I like to call the runaway 440 or 450 kilograms of uranium that was enriched to 60%. And you're right, that's assuming they have centrifuges somewhere. Although from the understanding that I'm hearing from Israelis, all their centrifuges, all the cascades have pretty much been destroyed. And Prime Minister Netanyahu did say that they no longer have any type of enrichment capability. They do still have, though, that stockpile of highly enriched uranium. And if they were able to run that through centrifuges, within days, maybe a week, they would have the military-grade uranium that's needed. And even in the absence of a warhead, they could test some sort of, crude nuclear weapon somewhere in the desert, make an explosion, and declare themselves a nuclear state. And that would have significant repercussions. So the question of if this war ends without America, Israel, anyone in the West getting their hands on that stockpile raises questions of, so was it all worth it if you don't get your hands on it? There's a couple of schools of thought that I hear within the Israeli, military and government. The first is, yes, there is the option of some sort of military operation. Israel has operated with special forces on the ground already in Iran. From my understanding, limited, but there have been Israeli boots on the ground in Iran and special forces operations until now. As you said, Michael, this is a whole different scale. This isn't you just go in, you pick up a couple of canisters and you fly them away. This isn't picking up Nicolas Maduro in the middle of the night with Delta Force, throwing him on a helicopter with his wife, and you're out, right? It's buried under Isfahan. Based on people who have analyzed the site, it requires digging, and it requires heavy machinery to dig to get to it. It requires troops, not just to go in and extricate the actual canisters, but also provide perimeter security, secure the facility, make sure no enemies are coming into the area. This is not just a couple of people who go in. This is a big operation. You said 48 hours. I've heard also, 48, 72. We're talking about a few days. That's a big deal, and that comes with a lot of risk, right?
Yeah.
That's not a small thing. And this is in the middle of Iran. This isn't,
Right.
somewhere on the coast or something like that. So that option does exist. Now, that could go sideways a lot of different ways that we don't yet imagine. And therefore, I think legitimately leaders are being cautious. There's another option, which is that the war ends in some sort of deal, that the Iranians give that up willingly, and it is handed off to a third party. Lots of people talk about Russia as an example. We all remember 2013, Barack Obama, Syrian chemical weapons, Putin and Lavrov broker a deal, and about 90% of the chemical weapons make their way to Russia from Syria. It's possible that Russia could again play that role here, and they're one of the few countries that actually has ties and the ability to communicate with Tehran and Washington, for that matter. There's a third option, and this I hear a little more of a possibility, which is the war ends with that stockpile still buried under Isfahan, and you just watch it 24/7,
right,
all the time. Everybody's watching it.
I hate this idea.
I don't like the idea
doesn't
either.
Seem reliable.
Right, and if they move it, you bomb it, you attack it, you intercept it, whatever it is. It doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound like that's the plan that you want for all of what's just happened, but I wouldn't disregard it as a real strong option here if the other two are not possible.
Yeah, I think the administration has raised expectations. They've said that part of this is to degrade the vestiges of the nuclear program, and if this part isn't taken care of somehow, I think it's a negative on the whole operation. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Yaakov Katz.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Yaakov, talk a little bit about the Israeli view of the new supreme leader.
Khamenei Jr., if we want to call him that. I think that there's also here two schools of thought for the most part. On the one hand, and as you know, Michael, when you are targeting a head of an organization or a supreme leader for that matter, you ask yourselves a number of questions. And this is how the Israeli targeted killing policy has long worked. The first question you ask yourself, is that person a legitimate target? Right? And you don't look at what they did, you look at that, you take that into consideration, but mostly you look at what they are still going to do. And is this something that has the potential to be seen as an act of self-defense? That's Israel's targeted killing policy. The second question you ask yourself is, what will the impact be? right? And does this really have a significant impact that it can do something to that organization? But the third question you have to ask yourself is, who will replace them? And, I've heard this over the years so many times about Hassan Nasrallah as an example, the late leader of Hezbollah, that he came to power in 1992 because Israel took out Abbas Musawi, who was his predecessor in southern Lebanon. And no one imagined that a guy like Nasrallah would take over and would turn Hezbollah into what it became. And it wasn't like that back then under Musawi. So it really sharpened the idea. You always got to ask yourself, who's coming next? Right. Is that person going to be worse? Are they going to be better? Are they going to be the same? So to the specific question, Khamenei, there are people who say, look, Khamenei was bad, evil, terrible, right? No questions asked. However, 37 years in the job, and he never took the decision to actually build the bomb when he could have. He kept on proceeding and taking small steps towards the threshold, but never crossed it. And there was a reason why, potentially. He understood that it would really be all-out war, that he never wanted to do that, and therefore having him in that job was actually some sort of guarantee that you weren't going to get any crazy surprises, because the devil you know sometimes is better than the devil you don't know. I think that the other school of thought now that you hear a lot is that the new leader, Machaba, who the son, has is just as ideological, is just as diehard, is just as radical, is just as hateful of the West, but also could be more extreme and radical in his decision now to pursue a nuclear capability. And I would say, though, and I don't know each of the potential ayatollahs or clerics that could fill that role, but if I'm the Iranian leader who's filling now in for Ali Khamenei, I mean, I make one simple decision, Michael. I'm going to get a nuclear weapon, because if I had a nuclear weapon, this never would have happened. Right. So I think that assumption has to be the case for no matter who's going to be in that role, as long as they're coming from that kind of same pool of people who have been ruling the regime for the last 47 years.
So part of the way people are handicapping it over here in the United States is similar to what you said. A real hardliner, maybe more extreme than his father, less capable. But what this is sort of leading to is that they're going to be, the IRGC will be in much more control of the country than they were, and that maybe the relative power of the clerics goes down in favor of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Does that ring true, and what's the view from there?
I think I hear that, and it does ring true, and for that reason Israel took out Ali Larijani, right, who was the kind of the de facto and the IRGC guy who was in the council, but then you read, and I don't know enough about these different characters themselves, but then I read a profile of his potential successor, who also everyone says is more extreme and more radical and could be even worse. I think that at the end, there's value here. If the objective, and like it started, was getting the Iranian people to seize this moment, they had to see that the men who had oppressed them and persecuted them for so long and so many decades, the real symbols of the regime, Khamenei, Larijani, the head commander of the IRGC, commander of the Basij, the chief of staff, they had to see that they can be killed, that they're not omnipresent, they don't have immunity. That is part of, I think, the effort to get the Iranian people to rise up. Because if all those people were still alive, in the eyes of the average Iranian, it would be maybe a harder leap of faith to believe that they can change something. But to know that somebody is there, Israel, America, together or on their own, independently, taking these people out, and that's part of the calculation here, is with the risk that it entails. It could be that the son is going to be more extreme than the father, but it is, Khamenei was such a symbol that the Iranian people needed to see that he could be removed, and maybe that can help push and motivate the change that we need from within.
Interesting. Okay. I want to run some regime scenarios by you, and then I want to get to the invasion of Lebanon, and then maybe we wind up with a little update from you on the elections, and then I'd love to hear what the view is of Gaza these days. But let's talk about regime scenarios. So let me just postulate a few here. Bear with me. Iranian surrender, very, very low confidence. No negotiated settlement, very low confidence in the near term. Some regime collapse, that's not going to happen. Trump sort of declares victory with or without a quote-unquote deal, or there's just sort of an unresolved ceasefire for some period of time. If I'm putting you on the spot here, are those about the right war-ending scenarios, and how do you see this going?
I think they're definitely right. And I think if we look at how definitely how the 12-day war ended, it just ended, right? There was no real mechanism. There was no guarantee or safeguard that they wouldn't rebuild and they wouldn't reconstitute. And clearly they did. And that's why this war had to be launched as it did at the end of February. But the idea that it just ends one day, like this, suddenly this afternoon, President Trump says, okay, we're done, and Israel stop attacking, would sound out of context after how long this has gone on for, right? We need, because otherwise what we're setting ourselves up for is another war at some point. Now, maybe it'll be longer this time. It won't be within 8 months. It will be within 18 months. But you have to have something in place that's going to prevent, at the very least, the reconstitution of the nuclear program, right? The ballistic missiles is definitely a very serious concern for Israel. Updated numbers on that, Michael, talk about how about 60% of the launchers have been destroyed, how Iran went into this with about 450 of them, which means that they still have about 200 or so that are still left. And I always take those numbers anyhow with a grain of salt, because that's assuming we know how many they began with, and it's assuming we know exactly how many we destroyed, and how many might just be buried somewhere, and once they dig them out, they'll be available once again. So I really take all those numbers with a grain of salt, but it's not enough. And at the very least, you have to have something in place that's going to stop the regime from rebuilding if you haven't brought down that regime. Now, it could be, though, and I think this is another option, is that we find ourselves kind of somewhere in the middle, right? The large kinetic offensive ends, and the focus moves to the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz becomes the so-called battleground, or what the war is about. And one of the ways that Trump declares victory is by saying, I've nationalized the Strait of Hormuz, or I've taken it away from Iran. It's now America, and it belongs to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, let's say. We now control it. And together we will secure it and protect it and escort ships. If that's what the war then becomes about, that has value and that will help with the price of oil and gas, but it's not going to stop the regime from rebuilding their capabilities. You might no longer have the big kinetic operations, but the regime could still try to cause trouble at sea, and it could still try to hit a vessel every once in a while. So there will be some type of low-intensity conflict that will remain. And you still haven't dealt with the real problems with the nuclear and the ballistic missile capabilities. You just kick the can down the road. So I think what you're describing is probably what's going to happen, right, in the absence of a toppling of the regime. But I do want to hold out for a hope that there will be something a little more, at the very least, in safeguards that prevents them from that reconstitution.
Part of the discussion in Washington is Trump going to stay the course? The military told him 4 weeks after the beginning of hostilities to substantially degrade drones and ballistic missiles and the rest. Or now that the Straits of Hormuz has gotten complicated, is he going to bolt and sort of declare victory or get out of this as soon as possible? I mean, my view is sort of like yours. I think he's got to hang in here for a little while longer. And I think Israel's view is, God, I hope he does, because you made us stop in the 12-day war, and we have a bunch of targets we need to get to before this is over. Does that sound right?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think, and by the way, what supports what you just said is how careful Israeli politicians and leaders are in their communication strategy. They're not saying much. They're not trying to take credit. They're letting the president lead. And Israel, if you think about it for a second, Michael, this is Netanyahu's dream. This is what he's wanted forever, for 30 plus years, is to see Iran taken on. And who would have imagined it would be in this joint Israeli-American operation? I mean, Israel is playing the role of what the United Kingdom played for America back in World War II. That's effectively what Israel's doing now. So on the one hand, this is his dream come true. On the other hand, he's not in the cockpit per se, right? It's the person making the decisions and calling the shots here is actually President Donald Trump. And if Trump says we keep going, then we keep going. But if Trump decides tomorrow it's going to end, and I hear some Israeli pundits and commentary that says, no, we might be able to continue, I say to them, then you really don't understand how this is going to play out. If Trump calls it done, it's done.
Right.
In Israel's hands, you saw it, what happened in the 12th Day War. We had 50 jets in the air on their way to Iran. And they turned around, they did a U-turn in the middle of the air and came back to Israel and didn't drop their bombs on their targets because Trump said, you better come back. So even more so in this case.
Right. Okay. So among the other issues that Israel is confronting now is the reemergence of Hezbollah. Entirely predictable, and I think everyone in Israel knew something like this would happen. But describe for us, are we in a situation where there's going to be a sustained ground offensive by the Israelis all the way up to the Litani River, and then are you going to sit there?
So look, you remember that when the ceasefire went into effect in November of 24, Israel kept 5 inside Lebanon positions, forward positions inside Lebanon, a few kilometers over the border, mostly for the purpose of keeping the high ground and preventing Hezbollah from ever trying to carry out some sort of incursion across the border. The 91st Division, which is one of the IDF's more elite standing infantry divisions, has crossed into Lebanon and has started to take up, beef up those 5 positions and to take up some of the southern Lebanese villages. And there is talk of they will start to move slowly through southern Lebanon, clear out the villages, and make their way up to the Litani River, which is anywhere from about, let's say 20, 25 miles away from Israel. It's something that Israel is definitely considering and is starting to implement. With that said, I don't feel, and I could be wrong, but I don't feel or sense an appetite here for this really to go ahead. I think it's a lot of posturing. And why do I say that? Because I think that Israel recognizes that there's a unique shift that's taking place right now. And I mean, there's 2 things that Israel keeps in mind. One is you don't want to spread yourself too thin. With the Iran war continuing, you have to be cautious of fighting on 2 fronts at the same time, and a big takeover of southern Lebanon, and more will drain resources even in a bigger way. And there have already been reports of depleting interceptors and stockpiles, et cetera. So you always got to be cognizant of that. But I think also Israelis see what's happened in the shift inside Lebanon itself. I mean, there is a government there that is openly saying and calling on America and calling on Israel, help us get rid of Hezbollah, stand down from this large-scale offensive, and let's move towards negotiations with Israel and potential normalization with Israel. So Israel doesn't want to do anything that, on the one hand, undermines that option, but it also has to defend itself and finally take down Hezbollah. Because, I mean, people are talking about, remember, there was the first Lebanon War in 82, there was the second Lebanon War in 06, there was the third Lebanon War that was in 2024. Are we now in the fourth Lebanon War? What I say to people is it's really one Lebanon War, if you think about it, right? And it's got to come to an end at some point. It's got to come to an end for the people of the north of Israel who are really suffering. It's got to come to an end for the people of Lebanon who are held hostage by Hezbollah. But I think that if Iran is dramatically weakened and definitely if the regime is toppled, and you have this government led by President Aoun and Nawaf, the prime minister, and you have this opportunity to really, for the Lebanese to take action together with Israeli help and American help and French help, whoever it is, maybe this can change without the need for the large-scale military offensive. But if that doesn't happen, I think Israel is extremely dedicated to the fact that it will have to do something militarily to change this reality in Lebanon.
So right now, the Israelis are making incursions beyond, but you wouldn't call it a full-scale ground invasion.
It's so far. First of all, it's one division so far.
Okay.
So, put things into perspective. We had in the Gaza war, just to give it for comparative purposes, we had 3-4 divisions inside Gaza. Gaza is much smaller, right? So if you're going to be doing a massive ground offensive in Lebanon, you're going to be calling up all reservists. You're going to have hundreds of thousands of people who are going to be joining the military, and you're going to have literally tens of thousands of soldiers inside Lebanon. We're not yet there. I think that there's saber rattling. There's there's action that is proving a determination, but it's not yet to the scale of what a massive invasion of Lebanon would look like.
Okay, 2 more issues, and then we'll wrap up. First, what's the view? Give us an update on Gaza. We don't hear about it as much anymore.
I think everyone forgot about Gaza.
Yes.
Is Gaza still an issue? Is there still something going on there?
Well, I was just thinking of the Board of Peace, but I haven't heard much since that big meeting.
So, it's true. The Gaza has kind of fallen to the side. It was the big issue, and not much has happened there. I've actually heard from Israelis and Americans alike in the administration that lots of different processes that were in place when the focus of everyone was on Gaza have also slowed down. Nothing really is moving forward. We still have a genuine problem with Gaza. And by the way, the reason nothing's moving forward is everyone is just distracted right now. They're preoccupied. All those joint command centers, you had the one that was built down south in Kiryat Gat, where you had all these militaries that were there, led by the Americans and the Israelis together. It's all shifted. No one's really thinking about that right now. But it will come back. And I think we still face the main challenge. And Nikolai Mladenov, who is the executive chairman of the Gaza Council on the Board of Peace and is in charge of the Gaza file, he's a Bulgarian diplomat, former foreign minister, former defense minister, and he serves as the head of the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. He just tweeted the other day that we are trying to move forward still with Gaza, but we have still the same impediment, and that is that Hamas is not disarming. And it's just an important thing to keep in mind, right? Israel has about 53% of Gaza under its control. Hamas has 47% of Gaza. So it's about 50-50. Hamas has replenished its ranks. It's back up to about 30,000 foot soldiers, if you could call them that. They don't have the same capabilities as they did before. It's interesting to point out, Michael, they haven't fired rockets, right, in this current war. And it's probably because they just don't have. But I also think even if they did have, why would they want to get involved and focus any attention on them? Better to sit this one out. There's nothing to gain. But they don't have the same sophistication of weapons, but they still do have weapons. And with that said, how can we imagine a different possibility in Gaza as long as they still have their weapons? The fact, though, that Mladenov and others who are working on this on behalf of the Board of Peace continue to insist on the disarmament, that gives me some comfort, because I the last thing I think any of us would want to see is we're skipping over that stage. And if we were to skip over disarming Hamas, then I think you and I could write out what happens next. It's just a matter of time. So that insistence is extremely important, but I wouldn't expect anything dramatic to happen until the North and definitely Iran are settled first.
Okay, well, we'll have to do another episode. Last question, and you wrote a terrific book called While Israel Slept, and it was how Hamas surprised the most powerful military in the Middle East. And inevitably, when people discuss this, some of the blame is put on Netanyahu. And if the elections were held the day after October 7th, I'm sure he would have lost. But he's hung on. He's arguably made Israel much safer. How much has he improved his electoral politics? First of all, remind us when the elections might be, and what are the chances Netanyahu comes out of this as the prime minister?
So first of all, I think you're 100% right. I mean, Netanyahu deserves the blame as the prime minister for pretty much the 15 years uninterrupted leading up to October 7th, his policies, his strategies, his decisions. But the changes that have taken place here, I would say objectively, have made this country safer and more secure than we ever were. And therefore, when we're going to have to go vote, you'll have to evaluate both sides of that coin and of Netanyahu's service now over the last definitely 4 years of this current term in office. Elections have to be held by the end of October. Now, in Israel, because we're a parliamentary system, so it's not a set date, the parliament decides on when that date will be held. Officially, the budget has to be passed by the end of this month, by the end of March. And if the budget does not pass, it automatically triggers a new election. The current predictions that I hear is that even if the budget does pass, Netanyahu's going to want to go to an early election. So he'll pass the budget, and at the same time, they will vote potentially to disperse the Knesset. So they'll topple the parliament. And then within 3 months, we go to a new election. Elections in that case could be held as early as June. The reason he would want to do that is because he would want to capitalize to the greatest extent possible on the successes of this war. And let's just remember that Netanyahu is going to have the best campaign manager now working for him, and that his name is Donald Trump, because no matter where Trump goes, Trump is going to say, we won. This was a major victory, whether it's true or not. And whether people like you or I say, well, what about the 450 kilos? And what about this? It doesn't make a difference. Trump will declare victory. Netanyahu will declare victory. And when Israelis see Trump and Netanyahu standing together in the aftermath of really the greatest illustration of Israeli-U.S. military alliance, that will help him in the polls. With all of what I just said, though, the current polls, just ones that were taken yesterday, show that still neither bloc, neither the right wing, the current coalition, the one led by Netanyahu, get to the needed 61 seats out of the 120 to have a majority, and neither does the opposition. But where you are seeing a significant shift is in his favorable ratings or his approval ratings. He's now up nearing back to 50%, which is dramatic. The people after him are in the 30s and in the 20s. So Naftali Bennett, former prime minister, is in the 20s. Gadi Eisenkot, a former chief of staff who tragically lost his son in this war, in the war in Gaza, he's now up to the 30s, but Netanyahu is far ahead of everybody. So it's not yet translating into seeing the voters that left him and moved over to the center left are now coming back home to Likud, to his party, or to the right bloc. But I think that could happen when a campaign really starts to pick up steam. So to make it really simple, if I was a betting man, I would put my money on him right now, to be honest.
That's great. Yeah, interesting. Yaakov Katz, thank you so much for joining NatSec Matters.
Thank you, Michael.
That was Yaakov Katz. I'm Michael Allen. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.